If I were to ask you to imagine a grisly murder in the 19th century, where a woman was not only murdered but dismembered, your mind would likely go to the killing spree of the infamous Jack the Ripper, who brought terror to the streets of London in the late 1880s. But the city of Norwich in Norfolk would see its own brutal killing of a woman over 30 years before the terror came to the streets of Whitechapel. And much like the more famous murders of Jack, it wouldn't be quickly solved. The killer would walk free for almost 20 years before a shocking confession would finally bring them to justice. The murder itself was the culmination of events during a turbulent marriage, coming to a tragic, bloody conclusion. The marriage had started pleasantly enough, although not in Norwich but London. It was the early 1830s, and William Sherwood was 24 years old. His work at the time is not exactly known, but he was either a pawnbroker's assistant or a tailor and lived in the Greenwich area, but either through work or social life had connections to the Walworth area of the city too. It would be while in Walworth that he met Martha Francis, 14 years his senior. Martha was a Norfolk woman, having been born and raised in the market town of Wymondham, south of Norwich, before she had moved to the capital looking for work. Their relationship would start as a professional one, with William employing Martha as his housekeeper. But things had moved fast, and they married on the 28th of October, 1836. It is unclear why they didn't stay in London. Possibly Martha had begun to grow homesick and longed to return to Norfolk. But it was only 2 years after they married that they moved back to her birthplace of Wymondham, lodging with Martha's twin sister, Mary. Despite what must have been a happy homecoming for Martha, settling in Wymondham wouldn't exactly be idyllic for them. William struggled to find work in the town, and although he is described as a quiet and inoffensive man, he's also said to have been a restless spirit and must have found a small market town a world away from the hustle and bustle of London. The search for work naturally led William and Martha up the road to Norwich where prospects were better, and soon William had found a job in what might have been his old profession, when he started working as a tailor on Burr Street. For many, this would be the end of their story, finally finding a stable job which they were skilled at, something that William had clearly done and was still working there in 1842. But William's restless spirit would act up again, only this time it would be the beginning of both his and Martha's downfall. Moving the pair of them to White Lion Street, he attempted to open his own tailoring shop, but Norwich had no shortage of shops of this kind, and he soon began to struggle to find work. By 1849, his shop was closed and he was bankrupt. Unsurprisingly, it was after this that the arguments between William and Martha really became nasty. With his marriage beginning to break down and a good number of debt collectors on his tail, William took a job in a pawnbroker and money lenders run by a man named Mr. Christie. While working there, he would utilise the services of Mr. Christie himself, giving him £400 to look after and keep safe from both William's creditors and his wife. While confessing the tale years later, William would describe his reasoning. In November 1849, I placed a box of money containing £400 in Mr. Christie's possession for him to take care of for me. In the year 1850 and June 1851, I drew from that box £150, during which time my wife had wanted me to bring the box home. Mr. Christie had asked me if he might make use of the money. My wife seemed determined to fetch the box herself. I knew that he, Mr. Christie, would not give it to me. Money was far from the couple's only problem. It was clearly an unhappy marriage that was doomed for failure. They had always been known for their arguments. Their age difference hadn't helped matters, and neither had William's constant flirting and attempted affairs with younger women. To keep ahead of the debt collectors, they would move yet again, finally settling in number 7 Tabernacle Street, a house that would come to live in infamy. On the 15th of June, 1851, as William prepared to go to work, another one of their arguments broke out. This one would be their last. No one was none the wiser of the terrible act that had just taken place in their midst, until a week later, on the 21st of June, Charles Johnson, a 34-year-old wood dealer, was taking his dog for a walk on a Saturday morning, walking between Trouse and Lakenham. They were in Martino Lane, now a busy road on the outskirts of the city, when his dog picked up what at first he thought was an animal bone. Removing it from the dog's mouth, he soon realised instead it was part of a human hand, 2 fingers and a thumb. Just 200 yards from where the hand was found, a foot soon came to light. Unsurprisingly, these discoveries were passed on to the police who investigated the area. But searches of crime scenes were far from what they are today. They left after only a couple of hours, looking in the general location and declaring they could find nothing else. It would be the next day a bit of pelvis was found by another dog walker only a short distance from where they had looked. This would be the opening of the floodgates, and over the next 5 days more and more bits of body were found scattered around the city. Chunks of flesh, entrails, and various bits of human remains were found, some as little as 300 yards away from Tabernacle Street. But it was only when body parts started turning up in places that had already been fully searched that it became clear whoever was doing this was still in the city. As the body parts came in, Police Sergeant Edward Peck was given the less than enviable task of trying to piece them back together and discover the identity of the victim. Not an easy task given the state of the body and the continuing discovery of more mutilated remains. In all, the grim discoveries stretched on until the 2nd of July 1851. If any more were dumped and never found after this date, we may never know. Certainly, Martha's head was never discovered. Sergeant Peck had done his best, but he was no expert on body parts. Surgeons William Nichols and Dr. Dalmell were called in to look at the remains and shed any more light that they could. They determined that the victim was certainly a woman, but who had ever cut the body up was certainly not a surgeon or a butcher due to the amateur nature of what had been done. Many of the found body parts were preserved in jars and kept in Norwich Guildhall in aid to hopefully one day solve the case. The information that had been gathered by these two surgeons were included on a poster placed around the city to inform the public of the ongoing situation. Supposed murder. Several parts of a human body belonging to a person supposed to have been recently murdered and to be that of a young female between the ages of 16 and 26 have been within the last few days found in the environs of the city of Norwich. Information is requested to be given to the Chief Constable at the Police Office, Guildhall, Norwich, of all females who may have been recently missing, together with any particulars that may lead to the detecting of the person or persons who committed such supposed murder. The portions of the body already found compose the right hand and foot and several bones, with numerous pieces of skin and flesh. Further search is making for the head and remaining body parts. H. Woodcock, Mayor. The poster did bring in several reports of missing women, but they were all next to useless due to the one big mistake that had been made by the surgeons identifying the remains, that of them being someone aged 16 to 26. Martha was 54. The press only added to the confusion by claiming the mystery might be nothing more than medical students from the nearby hospital playing a prank on the city, something that was soundly rebuked by those accused. All the time, while misguided reports were followed up and the papers pointed fingers at innocent parties, those who had noticed Martha's disappearance thought little that she might be the victim. With people beginning to wonder where Martha was, William quickly announced that she had left him, run off to New Zealand to look for a former lover of hers who had emigrated there years before. The story didn't sound unbelievable, as their raging arguments were well known by their friends, family, and neighbours. So her leaving the man who had made her life a misery to look for a lover from a happier time sounded possible. Also, as is often still the case today, the public interest in the murder didn't take long to subside. Another killing, this one in Holkham, North Norfolk, in the July of 1851, quickly became the main topic of gossip around the city. It might sound like William was brazenly flaunting his crime around, believing he was safe, but on the contrary, he was constantly on edge, especially when Martha was brought up. When Mary, Martha's sister, died in the November of 1851, he refused to attend her funeral and said he was sure there was no point trying to contact Martha as she wouldn't want to attend either. He's also said to have abruptly snapped at her brother when he asked if he knew how to reach her, as he wished to tell her about her inheritance from Mary. Shortly after, he moved from 7 Tabernacle Street, taking rooms in a boarding house in Middle Street, but would be thrown out of his lodgings within a year after being caught with multiple women in his room. After a short stay in the tavern, he moved to Lower King Street, a street that coincidentally I used to work on. From here, he set up his own pawnbrokers, but this was also where his heavy drinking first began. From here, his normal amount of self-control and bad luck raised its head again. He once again filed for bankruptcy, this time on the 4th of June, 1853, selling the remainder of his stock to another pawnbroker, a Mr. Boston from Orford Hill, Norwich. Of course, much of the money he raised from this was wasted once again as he turned to the bottle to cope. Surprisingly, during this, he began a relationship with another woman. Her name was Charlotte Maria Buck, and she was one of the women who had been caught with in his room in Middle Street. Despite his newfound love and 2 children it brought him, in 1856 and 1859, he is still said to have several lady friends around the city. William and Charlotte wouldn't marry until the 13th of February, 1862, almost 11 years after he did away with his first wife. All of this might seem like the start of a brand new life, and a chance to put a now largely forgotten crime in the past. But William was already in the throes of his downfall. Of course, his heavy drinking continued. He'd also picked up the habit of talking in his sleep, although, thankfully for him, he never said anything about the fate of Martha. He also began to show early signs of developing rheumatism. Little is known about his life for the next 6 years. but 1868 found him the pub landlord of the Key and Castle Tavern of 105 Oak Street, where he was by all accounts a stressed, guilt-ridden and depressed man. It was around the Christmas of that year that he left Norwich, travelling home to London to visit family. Possibly, William had always planned for things to go the way they did, or he felt the past was beginning to catch up with him, for he left his wife a note, saying she would soon learn of the trouble he was in. Exactly what kind of trouble this was came to light on the 1st of January 1869, when a rather worse-for-wear William Sherwood stumbled into Walworth Police Station and was met by Inspector Davis of P Division Metropolitan Police. When challenged by Davis about what he was doing there, William made a frank and surprising confession. "I want to speak to you. I have a charge to make against myself. It was for the wilful murder of my first wife at Norwich." As you can expect, Davis was rather taken aback by this statement, and had his doubts that it was little more than a New Year's Eve prank. He warned William of the seriousness of what he was doing, hoping to put him off. But William was determined, for the first time in nearly 20 years, to finally tell the truth. "I have kept it for years, but I can keep it no longer. I left home on the 29th of December, intending to destroy my life with a razor I have in my pocket." At this point he broke down, handing his razor over to Davis, and although only able to speak in broken sentences between his sobs, told of his intention of killing himself near where the paddle steamers were moored in Chelsea, but he couldn't bring himself to do it. He asked Davis to fetch some paper, as he wished to give a full confession. Giving Inspector Davis his details, William's confession was signed as such. "I, William Sherwood of Norwich, charge myself with the wilful murder of my first wife. Signed, William Sherwood." William was led away to the cells to spend his first night behind bars. The following morning, William still stood by his statement, confirming to the officer that he killed his wife on the 15th of June, 1851, and dismembered her body. He seemed fairly composed during this, but when asked to elaborate more on where these body parts had been found, as of course the London police knew nothing of the macabre hunt their colleagues in Norwich had undertaken those years before, he broke down again. "Oh, don't say any more. It's too horrible to talk about. I went last night to a house in Richmond Place, Walworth, where I first met my wife. That brought it so forcefully to my mind that I was obliged to come here and give myself up. They know all about it at Norwich." In his distressed state he was offered food and coffee. He accepted the coffee, but refused to eat, pointing out he'd been unable to eat since the 29th of December. As he languished in his cell, exactly what William had admitted to and the punishment he was about to face must have struck him. For 2 days after his confession, he attempted to retract his statement, but it was far too late. By now, details had been obtained from Norwich that matched up exactly to what he had been saying. He was taken to Horsemonger Lane Gaol, where he awaited his trial. He wasn't there long. It was on the 7th of January that the London magistrates decided he should be returned to Norwich to stand trial in the city of his crime. With a police escort, William was taken by train back to Norwich, arriving at what was then Thorpe Station, one of the city's 3 railway stations. The station still stands to this day, although it is now the only station in Norwich and simply known as Norwich Station. Word of a killer's return had obviously spread, and he was met at the station by a large crowd of locals clamouring to get a look at him. Also awaiting him was a shuttered, horse-drawn cab that he was quickly loaded into and taken to give his depositions to the magistrates at the city's Guildhall. Saying nothing, choosing to leave his defence until his trial, he was soon officially charged with murder and taken away to be held locally until his day in court. While William waited to face justice, the police force began to try and build a case against him, a task that wasn't as simple as it might sound, as although they had William's confession and the body parts preserved from the time of the murder, actual evidence that he was involved was rather hard to come by. The murder had of course happened many years ago. Several of the officers who had worked the case had now retired. Many of the witnesses had either died or simply forgotten what they had seen or heard in the time gap. And of course, medical and forensic investigations were a far cry from what we have today. In the course of the investigations, the police even ripped up the floorboards of number 7 Tabernacle Street, an act which cost them the sum of £3, a little over £350 today, a payment that the house's new owners demanded the police paid for the privilege of doing so, and even after this they found nothing. The trial began on the 29th of March 1869. The trial was overseen by Mr. Baron Piggott. Many came to watch the trial, but now, of course, William was far from the spry 39-year-old he was when he killed Martha. He was now in his late 50s, much the worse for wear for his decades of heavy drinking, crippled by his rheumatism, which had been made all the worse from his time spent in prison. The first witness called was in fact Inspector Davis from London, who told of the night William had wandered into his station to confess what he had done. Much of Davis's testimony has already been included here, as you have seen before. After Davis, it was Charles Johnson's turn, the man who had found the first of the body parts, telling of the dog walk which had begun all of this, that he had taken the hand to his father, who had then taken it to the police. Mr. Johnson had also been responsible for the discovery of 2 more body parts while aiding police in their larger searches. He was followed shortly after by his father, who confirmed his son's testimony. Many of the witnesses called simply talked about their discovery of what was left of Martha, so I won't go into many of them in the name of brevity, but a full description of the trial can be found in the description below if you wish to read through it yourself. But for William, each name coming to the stand must have felt like a nail in his coffin. Richard Fryer, Thomas Dent, Henry Layton, Samuel Moore, John Flaxman, Charles Grimes, and many more. Even people far more close to home for William were called. One was Dorothy Hewitt, one of Martha's sisters, who told of her desperation to try and get in contact with Martha, only to be rebuffed by the defendant, telling her that Martha would write to her if she wanted to. From the neighbours called as witnesses, there was no shortage of lurid tales of how Martha was controlled by her monster of a husband and largely kept away from her family before she suddenly disappeared. The final to speak was a Mr. Metcalfe, who spoke to the court on behalf of the prisoner, telling them that although he had confessed, he had since retracted this statement and was now pleading not guilty. He argued the point that although the prosecution had plenty of witnesses of the discovery of these body parts, there was no evidence of where the killing was meant to have happened or where the body was cut up, and that without anything to corroborate the statement William Sherwood had made against himself, the case should be dismissed. Final statements heard, Piggott summed up the case before sending the jury away to make their verdict. The trial may have lasted 2 days. The jury only took an hour and a quarter to find him guilty. He was sentenced to death by hanging. William's final statement in the court was simply, "I have nothing to say." He spent his final days in Norwich Gaol, living in the infirmary rather than the main prison due to his worsening rheumatism. The day before his death, he had a final visit from Charlotte, his current wife. After she left, he wrote a letter to her and his children asking for their forgiveness. It was also here that he would make a full confession of the events. William, who was at this time still in the employment of Mr. Christie, the pawnbroker and moneylender, had been given the task to travel to the fishing town of Great Yarmouth on the 15th of June to lend the captain of a waiting ship £1,000 to cover the cost of unloading. Undoubtedly, this captain had some arrangement to pay Mr. Christie back later. It was on the morning of the 15th, a Sunday, as William washed, shaved, and got dressed to travel. One of their now regular arguments broke out between him and Martha, once again over money. Martha demanded William not go to Great Yarmouth for his job, and if he did, she'd go straight to Mr. Christie and demand for the box of money he was looking after for William. Their neighbours probably took no notice to what was going on, just another argument in the Sherwood house. Nor did they find it strange when it abruptly ended, for Martha had made the fatal error of enraging a man holding a cutthroat razor. As William's confession told, an altercation occurred when I ran the razor into her throat. She never spoke after. I then covered an apron over her head and went to Yarmouth. I came home that night and slept on the sofa downstairs. Over the next week, William cleaned the house and burnt the clothes he had been wearing, but more drastic action was going to be needed, as decay had begun to take its toll on the body. Leaving work early, he prepared himself for the most morose part of the crime. Arriving home, he lit a fire in the bedroom and began the grim task of cutting up Martha's body. He worked until 9:30 that night, when he went out to dispose of some of the remains. He wandered the city, discarding bits of her here and there, before returning home an hour later. This would carry on each night that week, with the larger parts of Martha, such as her head, feet, and part of her hands, being boiled to make their disposal easier. He would never tell of what he did with Martha's head. Most likely, it was thrown into the River Wensum that flows through Norwich and ran very close to Tabernacle Street. On the 20th of April, William was taken to the awaiting gallows. He would make history as the first private execution in Norwich, meaning he didn't have to face the anger of a baying crowd in his final moments. Despite the execution being held behind the walls of the castle, a crowd of up to 2,000 people had gathered outside. The prison's chief warder, Hall, and warder Base led William to the executioner, William Calcraft, a man with a rather nasty habit of using short drops, a method that normally led to the accused strangling to death slowly. Calcraft saw him to the noose and covered his head. Pulling the lever, William Sherwood took the drop. Whether by accident Or maybe Calcraft had seen fit to show a small amount of mercy to a sick man and made his rope slightly longer, but William didn't seem to strangle. The few reporters in attendance reporting that his struggles were slight and brief. As William went down, the black flag went up on the castle, signalling the deed was done and the crowd outside had got what they came for. After his execution, William was taken and buried in the burial area for Norwich Gaol, an area which is now Norwich Roman Catholic Cathedral that was built on top of the site between 1882 and 1910. Martha's remains that had been preserved and were unclaimed by her family after the trial were buried under the Guildhall, where they remain to this day. And with this comes a strange irony that two people who both their lives and deaths are now largely forgotten are both buried under two of Norwich's most famous buildings. Tabernacle Street itself no longer exists. The whole area is now simply known as Bishopsgate. In more recent times, the murder was the inspiration for an escape room hosted in Norwich Guildhall in January 2019. It's somewhat split opinion, with some thinking it was a good act of remembrance, while others, especially one of Martha's descendants who still lived in the local area, finding the whole thing rather distasteful to say the least. The whole situation with the escape room is made even stranger as one of its biggest fans was a descendant of William who travelled all the way from London just to take part in it. But not all is a bleak ending for Martha and her family. Due to the concerns they raised about this escape room, they were able to use the controversy around it to get the area where Martha was laid to rest blessed by Reverend Fiona Halworth of the nearby St. Peter Mancroft Church, who said of the event, "This is not something I often do in these circumstances. We do funerals, but I'm assuming that for Martha, because of the circumstances of her death, it was unlikely there were prayers offered when she was buried, and it's a really good thing to be able to do." I hope you've enjoyed this presentation. All of the information and pictures used can be found in the description below. Feel free to subscribe and like if you wish. This was the Tabernacle Street Murder, Norwich's bloodiest crime, and this was a little bit of history.